From the world of politics.
Biden's budget projects we'll take the federal debt to $45 trillion. $45 trillion in the next 10 years. I don't know how we're going to pay off the $30 trillion.
To the world of business.
I think its days are ending as an energy superpower because the Europeans have basically said we're done. We don't regard Russia anymore as a reliable supplier. Their oil and gas is unwanted.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We're going to start again today with Ukraine. First of all, with sanctions mounting as the Senate voted earlier today to remove the preferred trade status for Russia, as well as to embargo oil and gas. It'll go over to the House. We're expected to pass as well. In the meantime, talks seem to be going nowhere between Ukraine and Russia. For an update, we turn now to the White House and our Washington correspondent. She is Anne-Marie Hordern. So, Anne-Marie, thanks so much for being with us. Where do things stand?
Well, as you said, David, we do have the Senate acting on the PNTR, the special trade status, and also the ban on oil and fossil fuel products, those imports from Russia. So now that has congressional approval. Once it goes to the House and the president will sign off on it, that already we knew was going to happen. Of course, we have the sanctions out of the United States yesterday. What we're really waiting on is the Europeans. Now, we know they are going to make this ban on coal, but there did seem to be a bit of debate from the likes of some of these countries that are saying maybe not 3 months should be the wind down. Can we add 1 more month? Should it be 4 months? And then also there are a number of European countries that don't just want to come out with a fifth package. When they come out with that fifth package, they want to signal to the world what is going to be next. And likely, potentially, David, they could start talking about hitting oil. I think at the moment still Russian natural gas is at the moment not on discussion on the table, but at some point we might get there. Because when I woke up, what I saw from President Mario Draghi last night speaking very late, he said at his press conference, do you want peace or do you want air conditioning going on all summer? And that's really the stance Europe is now asking their constituents.
Anne-Marie, you've covered this from the beginning, and I'm curious, do you think the line is moving when it comes to what Europe may be willing to consider, at least, on sanctions? There was a time that I thought that was off the table. It does appear to be on the table. And is that because of these alleged atrocities committed by the Russian troops?
This is what Mario Draghi has said. He said because of the massacres of civilians we are seeing, because of the images coming out of Bucha, he says that not right now natural gas is not on the table. But he said, and not on the table in terms of discussions, but he said we might get there because of these images and because the EU wants to make sure that they are speaking with a very strong and moving with very strong implications for the Kremlin on what is going on in Ukraine. But we should note, David, potentially it might come down to countries acting unilaterally, because we also heard yesterday from the likes of Hungary saying that for us will never be on the table. We will continue to import Russian fossil fuels, and we will start to listen to what President Putin asks for and pay for them in rubles.
Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern for that report from the White House. For a broader perspective on what is going on in this war in Ukraine, we turn now to Dr. Richard Haass. He's Council on Foreign Relations President and author of the best-selling book, The World, A Brief Introduction. So, Richard, thank you so much for being with us. We heard earlier today from Sergei Lavrov, you know him, foreign minister from Russia, who came out and said, we don't think the talks are going anywhere because we don't like what the Ukrainians are talking about when it comes to Crimea and Donbass. What do you think about the talks? Are they dead?
Well, it's a welcome statement of accurate truth from the foreign minister of Russia. Look, in order for talks to succeed, David, you've got to have protagonists who are willing and able to compromise. Mr. Putin is able to compromise. He's just unwilling to compromise. And at the moment, there's no overlap between the most Ukraine could be expected to offer and the least Russia could be expected to accept. So I think we've got to assume that the talks are going nowhere slowly, and that this war is going to continue for the foreseeable future and then some.
As far as we can tell, might that be part of President Putin's strategy at this point? I guess I would ask, is he playing to win at this point, or is his objective changed? He just is playing not to lose.
Well, I think he's still playing to win. He's just dropped his definition of victory, at least for the next phase. That's hence the focus on the East, to create some type of rump state there in the East that Russia controls, to depopulate it so they can't mount an effective resistance. And the real question to me would be if it's a big if Russia were to be successful in parts of the East, in the Donbass, for example, and in parts of the South, would that be enough, or would they then try to expand that? And that's something we simply don't know yet.
And what does a win look like for the United States, for NATO, and goodness knows for Ukraine at this point? And I guess a related question, whose side is time on?
It's a good question. Take your second question first. Time is not necessarily on either side. In our case, it's whether we, and working with Ukraine, can continue to provide them with the means to wage a war. And Ukraine obviously is going to bear the brunt of it, but they've got to get the arms they need. Russia, it's how well they are at navigating, among other things, the casualties in their military, and then the sanctions. So there's too many dynamics, and quite honestly, it's quite possible both sides will lose. That's often what happens in the when it comes to war.
You talked about getting the arms that they need. We heard from the foreign minister of Ukraine again today saying arms is what we need to have, not sanctions. Arms is what we need. From your perspective, Richard, do you think the line might be moving on what the United States and NATO might be willing to supply in terms of heavy armament, and particularly perhaps influenced by some of those images, those horrible images we're seeing coming out of north of Kyiv?
That's exactly right, David. So I think you'll have a little bit less reticence given these clear atrocities. And this is not Russian troops freelancing. This is not a lack of discipline. These are ordered executions. These are orders coming from on high, these war crimes. So yes, I think you will see, whether it's in the way of drones, anti-ship missiles, aircraft, and the like. I think you're going to see a quantity and quality of arms reach Ukraine. And I think one of the big issues here, and I think Anne-Marie alluded to it in her opening statement, David, is whether the Europeans at some point are going to take the big step on sanctions. All these sanctions going after children and the like and relatives are symbolic. What really matters is whether Europe will turn off the gas spigot. And until that happens, the sanctions won't really bite.
How critical is it from President Biden's point of view he keeps that alliance together? Because we heard from Anne-Marie, there's some question about Poland versus Germany and the timing of the coal that was announced yesterday. And then Hungary seems almost to be off on its own.
Look, you've got an alliance of 30 countries when it comes to NATO. They're never exactly on the same page. We prevailed in the Cold War despite differences, for example, how tough to be towards the Soviet Union. But there are some countries more important than others. Germany's the most important on sanctions. Poland's the most important when it comes to funneling military support. As long as we keep those two countries above all on the page, I think we're okay. The biggest question may be, David, what happens with the French elections this month? Do we have an outcome there where rather than having Mr. Macron, we have Marine Le Pen, who would represent a very pro-Russian policy? I think that's the biggest question in the near term about NATO solidarity.
Well, that's a really important question. But let me ask about another country that we want to try to at least have neutral or on our side, China. What is the U.S. policy for getting China to come as close to us as we can get them? Because there have been some actions taken, like Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, going over to Taiwan. There was an announcement about the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Now she has COVID, sadly, so she's not going. What is our strategy here in trying to get China to be closer to our side in this dispute?
I haven't seen much of a strategy other than to threaten China, saying you will get caught up in secondary sanctions if we see you as providing a significant lifeline to Russia. But I think the Chinese are saying, what's the upside? Why should we basically try to meet you halfway on this? What's in it for us? What you seem to have is a Trump administration and now a Biden administration competing for who can be more anti-China than now. So unless the United States starts offering China some degree of upside in this, whether it's particularly on the economic side, I don't think we're going to get much help. I understand why we're trying to signal Taiwan support. Taiwan doesn't want to be, if you will, the Ukraine of the Indo-Pacific, but we've got to balance that with some positive diplomacy vis-a-vis China, and that's largely been missing.
Well, I'm curious, Richard, because you talk to these people all the time. Do we have any indication, for example, I'm making this up now, but we've got these tariffs with China still. Couldn't we back off on some of those, for example, as a little bit of a carrot?
I would like to. These tariffs have been in place for several years. They've not accomplished anything in terms of their original goals. China has not restructured its economy. U.S. exports to China aren't going. These seem to me now to be symbolic annoyances. That's the sort of thing. But again, I think you've got an administration that, one, doesn't have a trade policy across the board, is not joining Indo-Pacific trade arrangements, and then they're worried about looking, quote unquote, soft on China. So I don't think there's likely to be much movement there. And as a result, or that and other reasons as well, David, I don't think we're going to see China come on over to our side. More likely, China is going to continue to straddle things, provide Russia with a degree of diplomatic and economic support, but not so much support that they get in the crosshairs of U.S. policy.
So, Richard, one final one. What about the United Nations? I mean, after World War II, I thought they were invented to try to address these sorts of situations. They seem to be just off the playing field altogether, although I should note, I guess they voted today to remove Russia from the Human Rights Conference.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll really get Mr. Putin's attention. The United Nations essentially is feckless, particularly when it comes to a situation where the major powers disagree. It's really just become now a theater, a venue for public diplomacy where the various powers promote their points of view. If you want to do serious diplomacy, you find another venue. But the United Nations essentially is not serving much in the way of a constructive purpose, I'm sad to say. The machinery that was invented 75 years ago, David, is no longer up to task.
Richard, it's always such a treat to have you with us. Thank you a lot for your time. I know you're awfully busy these days. That's Richard Haass at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of The World, A Brief Introduction. Coming up, we talk with a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congresswoman Dina Titus of Nevada. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, here is for the first word with Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. A warning from NATO's chief. The war in Ukraine isn't likely to end anytime soon. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke to reporters in Brussels after a meeting of foreign ministers.
Be prepared for the long haul. This war may last for weeks, but also months and possibly also for years.
Secretary General Stoltenberg says the alliance agreed to step up support for Ukraine to try to bring the war to an end. The World Health Organization is preparing for potential chemical attacks or accidents in the war in Ukraine. Speaking in Lviv today, Dr. Hans Kluge, the agency's European head, said his team is considering all scenarios. Dr. Kluge says the WHO has recorded more than 90 attacks on health facilities in Ukraine since Russia's invasion began, including attacks on hospitals, clinics, and ambulances, which he says violate humanitarian law. There's a new effort on Capitol Hill to fight so-called long COVID. Two Democrats, Senator Tammy Duckworth and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, are sponsoring a measure to authorize federal grants of up to $2 million for clinics to treat the chronic health problems that many people experience after having COVID. A $10 billion COVID spending package is stalled in the Senate. The Shanghai lockdown has threatened to become the biggest crisis of President Xi Jinping's tenure. The struggle by the city's 25 million people to obtain necessities like food and medical care has triggered rare pushback from many residents. Many are saying the Communist Party's COVID cure is worse than the disease. Shanghai's reaction could inspire other cities to resist lockdowns. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Congress has been an active participant in trying to persuade Russia back off of its war against Ukraine. And we welcome now a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She is Representative Dina Titus, Democrat of Nevada. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been active as well in voting for certain legislation. Let's start with the evidence of war crimes that we are seeing by the Russians. What can Congress do about that?
Well, accusing someone and then convicting someone takes a long time. And so even though we pass this bill now, until we can, actually maybe capture Putin when he leaves the country. It's mostly symbolic, but symbolism adds the strength of policy. So I think it's a good thing. We had a hearing on this recently. The bill has passed out of the House. I interjected an amendment to the bill to be sure that sex crimes, rape, and sexual violence were included in the definition of war crimes, because as we are hearing more and more about the atrocities in Bucho and around the country, a lot of those stories are starting to come from women who say that Russian soldiers have raped them as they've moved in to occupy some of these communities.
Congressman, there's a fair amount the United States can do and I know is trying to do. What about some other countries around the world? I know you met recently with the U.S., the Indian ambassador to the United States. What is the perspective of India, and can we get them to support us? Because thus far they haven't really.
Well, they would have to walk a fine line. It was very disappointing that the largest democracy in the world abstained on the vote in the United Nations. We know they have a complicated relationship with Russia. That's their largest producer or seller of arms in India. But certainly they should be playing a bigger role in helping to negotiate a ceasefire or a peace or an end to this war, and maybe you'll start to see that a little bit as more international pressure is put on India as kind of the leader of that area of the world.
Well, that's interesting. Just to pursue that, do you have any indication that they might actually play a larger role in the future?
Well, the ambassador certainly kind of told me what I wanted to hear and said that they have the potential to play a role, but he didn't step forward with any specifics. He was very careful to point out that India has that complicated, I think was his term, role to play with Russia.
And what about China? We all are talking about China and where it stands in this issue. Of course, we had that pledge of sort of friendship between President Xi and President Putin early on in this. Where does China stand? Are there things the United States could do to sort of give them an incentive to come in, to be neutral, or even to come in on our side?
Well, it seems like whatever the question in the world politics today is, the answer is China. China is always a player, and now it is one of the big two players, I believe. We've been careful not to force China into assisting Russia, but I think China kind of delights in seeing standing back and let the two of us fight it out. You know, we've imposed a lot of sanctions on Russia itself, on Russian oligarchs, on members of Putin's family, on Russian banks. The next major step is to impose sanctions on those who trade with Russia. We haven't gone that far yet, but that might be part of the calculation when we look at China.
Well, let me ask you that question from your point, from where you sit. Are secondary sanctions, should they be on the table?
Well, I think everything is on the table at this point. It's been an escalation of sanctions, and we have imposed more than ever in the past. And the interesting thing, too, is most of those are also imposed by our allies. You know, if Putin wanted to separate NATO or emasculate it, it's had just the opposite effect, that NATO countries are very united, and even some of those kind of secondary partner countries are taking a bold stand against this unprovoked invasion.
Congresswoman, finally, let me make a turn here back to COVID-19, which is on all of our minds. It's still very much with us. There is this proposal for some additional appropriations to deal with COVID. It started out north of $20 billion, it's down to $10 billion. I talked to Dr. Anthony Fauci yesterday. He said it's critical. We're going to start running out of tests, running out of vaccines, running out of therapy. Are we going to get that passed, and when?
Well, I hope so. You know, once again, the Senate has backed this up. It's passed through the House. And there are a lot of us, me included, who supported not only the money for fighting COVID here in this country, because it's not over. Every time we think we can get back to normal, you get a new variant, and that's what's happening now. But COVID doesn't know borders. I mean, COVID is a universal problem, and so that's how we should deal with it. And at a time when we're trying to be a leader of the world, engaged in other countries, taking the lead on what's happening in Ukraine, we shouldn't decide not to spend money to help address COVID, the pandemic, around the world. And so I'm disappointed that the Senate has pulled that money back for the global involvement. And I wish they'd get busy and pass whatever is left, or they can get out of their house for internal involvement.
Yeah, you said exactly what Dr. Fauci said, which is this virus does not know any boundaries. It doesn't stop at the border. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for being with us. That's Representative Dina Titus, Democrat of Nevada. Still to come, we're going to get to talk with the head of the International Rescue Committee, he's David Miliband, about the refugee crisis in and around Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
The war in Ukraine rages on.
President Putin's invasion is brutal.
Turn to Bloomberg for up-to-the-minute reporting from around the world and analysis of what it all means to you.
The intention here is to increase the pressure on the sanctions front.
I think the United States policy is that the sanctions continue until President Putin is no longer there.
For continuing coverage from Ukraine and around the world, keep it tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to take a look at the markets right now, with the bond market particularly moving once again. And to take us through it is Kriti Gupta. So look at that 10-year.
Yeah, 264 on the 10-year. Who would have thought? I mean, look, the movement in the bond market today isn't as aggressive as it has been in the past couple of days, right? We did 17 basis point moves, 10 basis point moves. Today, the yield is only up by about 5 basis points on the 10-year, which is still significant, I should add, just not perhaps relative to what we've seen this week. And you can see it's that volatility that is shaking the rest of the markets as well. The stock market is down, the NASDAQ really taking it on the chin. What's interesting is that commodities are losing some of their momentum as well. Brent crude, for example, now below $100. That is for the first time since March 17th. And you can see that's really applies to the Bloomberg Commodity Index as a whole. I think when we talk about what the most important market to watch is right now, it's that yield curve inversion, which I should say is no longer inverted. And that's really important because you're seeing some very aggressive steepening. And one of the things about the yield curve inversion is how long does it actually stay inverted? And for our TV audience, you can see that it doesn't stay very long. For our radio audience, it really only stayed inverted for about 2 sessions. So good news, perhaps.
Yeah, but we're still not sure how accurate a predictor it is of the recession, right? Which is why we look at that. Right.
And once again, it comes down to, is it inverted for a longer period of time? Right now, it doesn't really seem to be.
Okay, so one of the things we're all talking about is currency. What about the dollar?
We got to talk about the dollar. The dollar is a little bit higher on the session, but the reason this is so important is because of exports, because the United States is not just a consumer-oriented economy. It also has a lot of exports, agriculture, oil, defense, and the dollar is a really big part of that. It's actually strengthening. So is the demand for those commodities big enough to kind of overshadow the strength in the dollar? You usually see an opposite relationship.
Yeah, and I guess my question, I don't know if it's knowable, is that because it's a safe haven trade where people want to go into the dollar, or is this actually a bet on the U.S. economy?
This looks like a rates trade. This is all about the Fed and inflation.
Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for that report on the markets. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton with the first word.
David, thank you. The United Nations General Assembly has voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. The measure passed with a vote of 93 to 24. 58 nations abstained. It was the first time a nation was suspended since a similar vote against Libya in 2011. There may be new evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. According to Germany's Der Spiegel magazine, German intelligence picked up radio chatter between Russian soldiers talking about killing civilians outside Kyiv. In one conversation, the report says a soldier claimed he shot and killed a cyclist. Officials say the intercepts indicate the killings weren't carried out by rogue forces, but may have been a deliberate strategy to instill terror. Russia has said images of civilian corpses in Bucha were staged. Pakistan's Supreme Court says Prime Minister Imran Khan's move to dissolve parliament was illegal and is ordering that the House be restored. Today's decision came after 4 days of hearings by the top court. Khan will now face a no-confidence vote by lawmakers that he had tried to sidestep. That will likely take place on Saturday. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has tested positive for COVID-19. Her spokesman says she is not currently experiencing any symptoms. The 82-year-old is fully vaccinated and tested negative earlier this week. Speaker Pelosi was at the White House Wednesday afternoon in close proximity to President Biden and others at a bill signing ceremony. A congressional delegation trip to Asia, which Pelosi was leading, has been postponed. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, when it comes to Ukraine, it's the humanitarian aspects of what's going on that really grip all of us so deeply. And we turn now to somebody who really knows what is going on the humanitarian side. He is David Milliband, President and CEO of International Rescue Committee, and of course, the former United Kingdom Foreign Secretary. So, David, thank you so much for being with us. Give us some sense of the size and scope. We see individual pictures and we see anecdotes, but you have a sense of how big the problem is. And if you would, divide it between the internally displaced people, that is, people within Ukraine have lost their homes, as opposed to those who've fled across the border.
David, it's great to be with you. Thank you for your interest. I think it's important to realize that there are three groups of people in humanitarian distress. There are those trapped in towns and cities where there is fighting. There may be 8 million of those. There's then people, as you exactly rightly say, who are on the run inside their own country, internally displaced people. There's about 7 million of those. Who have fled more or less from the east, the south and east to the west. And then thirdly, there are the refugees of whom, according to the United Nations figures yesterday, 4.2 million now, over 2.5 million in Poland alone. So you can see the three different fronts of the humanitarian need and three different sets of humanitarian needs. Essentially, it's about getting aid to people inside Ukraine. And when they're refugees beyond Ukraine, when they're safe, it's about helping them keep their lives going until they're able to go back.
David, I must say that's a really helpful breaking down of it for me, because I do understand it, but it had not occurred to me. I believe you said 8 million people, Ukrainians, are trapped in cities and other places where they can't get out because there's shelling going on?
Well, that's right. Obviously, the most famous case is the appalling situation in Mariupol, which is in the south east of the country. 120,000 people, originally 400,000 people in the city. I'm not sure it's on the map that's up at the moment, but if you look to this, it's in the south and to the southeast. But then there are other cities that aren't fully besieged, but that are under fire. It looks like Russian forces have withdrawn from Kyiv. That's why I was rather tentative about the 8 million figure. It was 2 weeks ago, 12 million people in cities, towns and cities where there was fighting or shelling. Now it's a smaller number, but it's still a serious risk to life and limb. And obviously the pictures and the stories that are coming out, the research and documentation of civilians being killed speaks to the level of impunity that is present, not just in this war, but others around the world at the moment.
I'm sure that what you and others like you, but you at the IRC can do, depends on which grouping people are in. Is there anything you can do for the people under siege? And then what happens with the displaced people within Ukraine? And then further, the people who've escaped into Poland or other neighboring countries?
Well, the first priority for the people who are under siege or are caught up in the fighting is obviously to get supply lines for food, for the healthcare needs, pharmaceuticals, frankly, cash as well to keep the market economy going, and then the water, electricity infrastructure. And in large parts of Ukraine, that continues to be possible. Access is pretty good, but there are places like Mariupol that are cut off. And obviously, in many of these places, it's dangerous. For the internally displaced, the second group who fled to the west, access is relatively straightforward. There is an economy functioning, and the Ukrainian government's health ministry, for example, is running the health centers that we are supporting. So there is good access there. And then obviously, when you're in Europe, it's an organizational question, not really a risk question. The organization of such large numbers of people flowing across a border in such a short period of time is unprecedented since the Second World War. But there are serious governmental and non-governmental agencies, plus the international system through the UN, supporting that.
Well, let's talk about the international assistance, whether it's private or public, because as you described this, whatever else, this is going to take a lot of money to try to support these people and help these people. Where does the money need to come from and where does it need to go to? What sort of level of commitment needs to be made?
Well, it's interesting that the response to the Ukraine crisis has been extraordinarily committed from not just in the West, but significantly in the Western countries. Policy decisions, but also members of the public, both giving money and volunteering to open up their homes to Ukrainians. About $12 billion has so far been pledged in aid packages, although it's hard to get a final figure for that. That's not just for in Ukraine, that's in Europe as well. That means about, we think, $800 to $1,000 per person in need. Now, that is much higher than the level of help that's offered in Afghanistan or Syria or other parts of the world. And given what's happening to food prices that you've covered on your program, partly as a result of the Ukraine conflict, that's obviously a concern. There's a further point which I do want to make, which is obviously this is all money when it comes to the Ukraine question to deal with the symptoms of the current crisis. There's a wholly separate bill which is going to run into the hundreds of billions, if not the trillions, which is the rebuilding of the country eventually. I don't myself think that's going to be in the short term, but that's important to give you a full picture.
David, we've seen some heartwarming stories about some of the people, for example, in Poland in particular, who sort of reached out to the refugees and incorporated them. Is that uniform across the countries? Are there differences among Poland and Hungary and Germany and Romania?
I think it's been pretty good, David. I mean, the European Union countries, 27, all agreed that there would be 3 years worth of work permits, residency, access to services, and that's been pretty good. The UK, Switzerland, Norway, 3 European countries that are outside the European Union, they haven't been as good, and we're urging them to do better. But it's been pretty good. What I think we want to argue is that the kind of response that's being offered to the victims of the Ukraine crisis is precisely the kind of help the refugees, whether they're from Syria or from Myanmar or anywhere else, need, because they're fleeing for their lives and they deserve to be treated as human beings.
David, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, because before this happened, I think there was something like 70 million refugees around the globe. I mean, before we get to Ukraine, we're all focused on Ukraine, as we should be, because it's an urgent crisis. At the same time, what does this say about the larger problem, challenge, crisis that we have around the world?
Yeah, the figure you've got in your head, I think, David, is the 82 million people who are either refugees or internally displaced. More or less 32, 34 million are refugees and asylum seekers before the Ukraine crisis. And about 45 million are internally displaced. So, for example, in Syria, there are 6 million refugees out of the country and 8 million people homeless inside the country. And so you're absolutely right to say that this Ukraine crisis is piling agony on top of an already crisis-ridden situation, where diplomacy is failing, where the legal regime for protecting civilians in war is failing, and where, frankly, too many states are failing in their own responsibilities.
Yeah, well, we're all fortunate to have places like the International Rescue Committee to help us address that, and we should all support you. Thank you so much, David Milliband.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks a lot for being here, David. It's David Milliband. He's President and CEO of International Rescue Committee. Coming up, European Commission Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager on European efforts to rein in big tech. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's a special time of year for antitrust lawyers in Washington. Why, you ask? Because the ABA is having their antitrust section annual meeting. And for the occasion, they brought in a very special guest who is responsible, oversees competition policy for the European Commission. She is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margaret Versteller. So thank you so much, Madam Commissioner, for being with us. First of all,
it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with what is big news for many people in the business community, and that is the Digital Markets Act, which you got through, which would have competition or antitrust regulation for what you called gatekeepers, as I understand it, the very large digital companies. Explain to me what that does.
Well, the aim is really simple. It is to make sure that the market is open and contestable. So you know that your success depends on your ideas and your work ethics and your funding, and not whether some giant company let you in or not. Of course, after that being said, it gets technical and complicated. But I think it's really important to send that signal that you can invest in innovation in a smaller company and it will have a fair chance of bringing their services and their products to the market.
So it goes to the heart of one of the questions as we talk about antitrust regulation, potentially, of large tech here. Are we trying to protect the user or the consumer, or is it to really create an environment where new companies can grow up and eventually become serious competitors of the big guys?
Well, I think as consumers, we are poorly served if we have to rely on the big companies themselves. You know, I just spoke with a smaller company the other day, and they said our payment solution is so much more advanced than what we are forced to use with one of the big companies. We want space to be able to show people what we can do when it comes to payment solutions. I do think that innovation flourish when you have an open and contestable market. And that is what we need when it comes to technology, to see it move on, not just depending on those who keep the gate.
So, as I say, you're in Washington for these meetings, and some of the other people there are antitrust regulators from the United States side, both for the Antitrust Division, the Department of Justice, as well as the FTC. What about coordination? Is there a potential coordination on issues like this between the EC on the one side and the U.S. on the other? Because otherwise it can get pretty complicated for companies trying to comply.
Yeah, we have a pretty close dialogue. We would have that on cases, could be merger cases or antitrust cases, if we get the necessary waivers from companies. And I think that works well for companies, in particular in merger cases, because if there is a competition problem, then sometimes a company can solve that to the satisfaction of both jurisdiction just with one remedy. So I think the cooperation between us serves the community, business community very well. When it comes to policies of the future, we have started a new dialogue in order to push forward to see how can we coordinate, because we have different legislation, we have different markets, but still, could we, to the benefit of a fair competition, do more than what we do right now?
Do borders even apply when it comes to things like social media? I mean, or as a practical matter, if you can impose regulations and change behavior on a Google, to pick one, or Facebook or something, does it become worldwide almost necessarily?
Well, not necessarily. I think it really depends on choices, strategic choices made in the companies, whether they say, okay, eventually these European rules will be the global standard, so we apply them everywhere for ease of doing business and for the efficiencies that comes with it. Or we say, no, we just wait and see, so we only do it jurisdiction by jurisdiction, we test here and then we'll see. I think it's an important point that it's something that happenings all over the planet. In South Korea, they passed legislation on app stores. It came into effect mid-March. So this is another example. They're passing legislation in Australia. So when you also look at the bipartisan approach here in the U.S., I think it's really important for tech to see, well, okay, the world is changing.
Margaret Versteller, I'm very mindful of the fact that you have responsibility not just for competition, understanding, but for the so-called digital age, a broader digital mandate here. Move over for a moment to Ukraine, because I've seen reports that the European Commission is considering regulations on cryptocurrency to make sure that Russia, in particular, could not avoid sanctions by use of cryptocurrency. Is that correct? And if so, where does that stand?
Well, you know, everything is on the table. And we have the first, the big packages of sanctions. And what we do is, of course, to, really watch carefully what will it take to maintain the effect of these sanctions, because the Russians, they try to find a way around it. So, we do what it takes to maintain the effects of the sanction on ground. And, of course, looking if cryptocurrencies is being used as a way to escape what is a tough and heartfelt sanction on ground in Russia.
And as far as you know from the work that you've done so far, is there any indication that Russia might be using cryptocurrencies to get around the sanctions?
Well, we are still in the process of analyzing and figuring out how to deal with it. So I don't think I should be too conclusive at this point in time.
Fair enough. Let me ask a different part of the Ukrainian question, if I could, and that's Gazprom, the natural gas provider that was actually subject to a competition or antitrust proceeding, as I understand it. There was a settlement, I believe, that came out of it, but there's an investigation going on right now. Is part of the reason why the natural gas prices have spiked up so high because of potential anti-competitive activity?
Well, you're right to say that we had one Gazprom case that we settled to the benefit of many of their customers, and Gazprom is still, living by the commitments in the contracts that they signed up after the case. Now we're investigating again. There may be a competition case. We haven't concluded that yet. But it may be broader as well. I think here policies, they are at stake as well, because we have seen for a very long time that sort of the supply into storage, for instance, in Europe, was very much changed by Gazprom priorities, so that as it is now, the storage in Gazprom storage is at an all-time low.
Let me ask more broadly how it's working within the European Commission right now, because you're such a senior official there. Is there an effort to find ways in which some more pressure can be brought to bear on Russia? I mean, I'm particularly mindful of some of those images we're seeing coming out of Ukraine of what appear to be war crimes.
Well, it's really disturbing at a level I've never expected to experience. It's in Europe. It will have a global effect, this war, but it is in Europe, and I don't think anything can be seen as an answer to the killing, to the meaningless, grotesque violence that we see on ground. Only sort of the persecution, the evidence of war crime, bringing the responsible to justice. But that doesn't change the fact that sanctions must increase over time, and everything is on the table. There are no taboos. And of course, we look into energy as well. We made a plan for Europe to reduce the dependency on Russian gas with 2/3 by the end of the year. As you will know, right now, coal gets into the most recent package. And as said, we discuss it with no taboos.
Is it possible that people could ask for waivers or special permission with respect to competition policy in order to achieve that freedom from Russian gas and oil?
Yeah, we have sent the signal that businesses can come to us if they need comfort in something that they want to do as a follow-up to the war in Ukraine, while at the same time signaling that we will keep an eye if there are someone who's trying to take advantage of the situation. And I think both signals are really important. Accommodating the businesses who really need to do something together in order to react to the war. And of course, also telling people who just want to try to, make a fortune on a war situation and on other people's misery, that we will indeed be looking out for them.
Margaret Versteller, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you taking time away from your meetings there in Washington. That's Margaret Vestager. She's Executive Vice President of the European Commission. Coming up, rates may be rising, but the deals keep on coming. We are going to go over the latest of those deals next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we all know, the yields on bonds are going up, which might make you think there'll be less deals, but it sure doesn't feel that way. Kriti Gupta is going to bring us up to speed.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of cash on people's balance sheets, right? And there's a lot of concerns about inflation. So if you have, say, $100 in your piggy bank today and you're worried that's going to be worth less tomorrow, kind of best to spend it, right? And that's the kind of idea that's really fueling some of these kind of merger mania that you're seeing. Just today, we had 3 deals get announced. The first, which is I think probably the most newsworthy here, is of course Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway buying a stake in the laptop maker HP. Ticker, of course, is HPQ. This is a stake valued at more than $4.2 billion. You also have the world's biggest tanker fleet looking to merge. You also have Brookfield Business Partners looking into a deal with CDK Global. What you really need to know, though, is that once again, this really comes down to cash flow. There's a lot of money in the system right now. So it really comes down to the idea of spend it now or perhaps have a little less to spend in the future.
And Warren Buffett getting over his aversion to tech.
Yes, which is interesting. Remember, he made a big bet in Occidental a few weeks ago. So this kind of seems like a little bit of a bet on the consumer, right? Consumer electronics, oil demand. So I wonder if that's what's going through his mind.
Well done. Good job. Okay, thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for that report on the markets. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on the radio side. Bloomberg Radio will bring you a second hour, and we're going to talk to Carly Fiorina about what the lockdown in Shanghai could mean for U.S. business. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.